Every human population ever studied, every culture, every civilization going back as far as records exist has had gay people in it. Not most cultures. Not cultures in certain parts of the world, or cultures that were exposed to certain ideas from the outside. Every single one. Ancient Rome had it. Pre-colonial cultures across Africa and the Americas had it. Indigenous populations that had no contact with the Western world had it. Societies that actively punished it had it. The pattern holds everywhere you look, across every era and every corner of the planet, and that's not an accident. Here's the thing about patterns in biology. When something shows up that consistently, in that many different places, across that many different time periods, you're not looking at a cultural trend. You're looking at something much deeper. Culture can spread ideas. It can shape behavior. But it can't manufacture the same trait independently in populations that never had any contact with each other. Whatever is producing this, it's not coming from the outside. It's coming from the inside. Now, here's where it gets genuinely strange. Evolution works by filtering traits over generations. The traits that help an organism survive and reproduce tend to stick around. The ones that don't get quietly removed from the gene pool over time. That's the basic logic, and it's worked pretty reliably for about 4 billion years. So when you apply that logic here, you run into a problem almost immediately. If a trait reduces the number of offspring a person has, natural selection is supposed to gradually push it out. Over thousands of generations, it should become rarer and eventually disappear. But homosexuality hasn't disappeared. It hasn't even gotten rarer. It's sitting at roughly consistent rates across every population researchers have ever measured, which by evolutionary standards makes no sense at all. That's the puzzle. Not a philosophical one, not a political one. A straightforward biological one. Why would something that appears to reduce reproductive success persist at stable rates across every human population on Earth for as long as human populations have existed? The fact that nobody has a single clean answer to that question is not because scientists haven't looked hard enough. It's because the answer turns out to be genuinely complicated and probably involves several different mechanisms working at the same time. And to understand why that is, you have to go back a lot further than you'd expect. Before we get to humans, it's worth knowing that same-sex behavior has been documented in over 1,500 other animal species. Not a handful of edge cases, not zoo animals with nothing better to do. Over 1,500 species observed in the wild behaving this way consistently and repeatedly across decades of research. Penguins do it, dolphins do it. Bonobos, which share about 98.7% of their DNA with us, engage in same-sex behavior so frequently that researchers who study them stopped treating it as unusual a long time ago. Male lions form pair bonds with other males. Bottlenose dolphins have been observed in long-term same-sex partnerships. Rams in domestic and wild populations show exclusive same-sex preference at rates of around 8%, which is a number that should sound familiar. And the list doesn't stop with mammals. It runs through birds, fish, reptiles, and insects. These aren't isolated incidents in a few scattered species. The behavior appears in surprising concentrations across populations. In some cases, same-sex partnerships are so common, they represent significant breeding pair portions, suggesting this behavior has substantial evolutionary staying power. Take the fruit fly. A single gene mutation called fruitless causes male fruit flies to exclusively court other males. One gene. That's how close to the surface this sits in the biology. It's not a complicated behavioral cascade or a learned social pattern, it's a switch, and when it flips, the behavior changes completely. On the other end of the size spectrum, female Laysan albatrosses on the Hawaiian island of Oahu form lifelong same-sex pair bonds. They build nests together, take turns incubating eggs, and raise chicks side by side. In some colonies, same-sex female pairs make up nearly a third of all nesting pairs. These are wild birds. There's no cultural influence, no social messaging, no peer pressure, just behavior that evolved and stuck. What makes this significant isn't any single species. It's the pattern across all of them. When you see the same behavior appearing independently in fruit flies and dolphins and birds and primates, that tells you it's not a fluke. Convergent evolution doesn't produce the same outcome over and over by accident. Something in the underlying biology is generating this, and it's doing it across wildly different nervous systems, wildly different environments, and wildly different evolutionary histories. The argument that same-sex behavior is unnatural runs directly into this problem. If unnatural means rare or anomalous, it doesn't fit. If it means absent from the animal kingdom, it definitely doesn't fit. What the animal record actually shows is a trait that keeps emerging, keeps persisting, and keeps doing so without any obvious mechanism selecting it out. That's not what a random error looks like. That's what a stable biological feature looks like. When something shows up that consistently across that many different branches of life, it stops being an anomaly and starts being a feature. In 2019, a team of researchers published the largest genetic study of sexual orientation ever conducted, pulling data from nearly 500,000 people. The goal was straightforward: find the gene responsible for homosexuality. What they found instead was that there isn't one. Not a single gene, not a single switch. What they found was more than 1,000 genetic variants scattered across the genome, each contributing a tiny, almost imperceptible amount to the overall picture. No single variant determines anything on its own. They're more like individual notes than a melody. The study was a genome-wide association study, which means researchers compared the full genetic profiles of people who reported same-sex attraction against those who didn't, looking for patterns. And patterns showed up, just not the clean, simple kind anyone was hoping for. Taken together, all of those variants explain somewhere between 8 and 25% of the variation in sexual orientation across the population. That range sounds underwhelming at first, but in genetics, explaining even 8% of a complex behavioral trait is actually a meaningful signal. It means genes are genuinely involved. It means this isn't random noise. Twin studies had already been pointing in this direction for years. Identical twins who share nearly all of their DNA are more likely to share sexual orientation than fraternal twins who share roughly half. That difference is exactly what you'd expect if genetics plays a real role. But here's the part that keeps things complicated. Identical twins don't always match. One twin can be gay and the other straight, even with virtually identical DNA. So genes matter, but they clearly aren't writing the whole story themselves. Something else is filling in the rest. What researchers can say with confidence is that sexual orientation is partly heritable. That word heritable carries more weight than it might seem. It means the trait gets passed down through generations. It means it runs in families in a pattern that isn't just coincidence. And it means that over thousands of generations of human evolution, natural selection had every opportunity to eliminate these variants and didn't. That's not an accident. Traits that stick around despite evolutionary pressure tend to stick around for a reason. The genome-wide study also found something worth noting. The genetic variants linked to same-sex attraction aren't clustered in one place or tied to one simple pathway. They're spread across multiple chromosomes, touching systems involved in everything from hormone regulation to brain development. That kind of distributed architecture suggests this isn't a bug in the code. It looks more like something woven into the broader fabric of human biology at a pretty fundamental level. And that raises the obvious question, the one the data keeps pointing toward without quite answering. If these variants reduce reproduction in at least some of the people carrying them, why hasn't evolution steadily weeded them out over time? Genes clearly play a role, but they don't determine it, and that gap between plays a role and determines it is where things get interesting. Here's where evolution becomes a genuine puzzle. Natural selection is one of the most reliable forces in biology. Traits that help you survive and reproduce get passed on. Traits that don't get filtered out. That's the logic, and it works. So when you apply it to same-sex attraction, something strange happens. A man who is exclusively attracted to other men is, on average, going to have fewer biological children than a man who isn't. Fewer children means fewer copies of his genes in the next generation. Run that math across thousands of generations, and the genetic variants linked to that trait should slowly disappear. The logic sounds airtight. It's also been failing for millions of years. Because those variants haven't disappeared, they're still here, spread across every human population on Earth, showing no sign of being selected out. That's not what you'd expect if this were a simple reproductive disadvantage. Something else is going on. The question is what? One possibility is that the relevant genes aren't doing just one thing. In genetics, this is called pleiotropy, a single gene influencing multiple traits at once. And evolution doesn't evaluate genes in isolation. It evaluates outcomes. If a particular set of genetic variants reduces reproduction in some individuals but provides a strong enough advantage somewhere else, the math can still work out in their favor. The variants stay in the population because on balance, they're doing more good than harm. This is what researchers call balancing selection, and it shows up all over biology. The gene variant responsible for sickle cell disease also provides partial protection against malaria. Carrying one copy is an advantage. Carrying two is a serious illness. Evolution didn't eliminate it because the benefit in one context outweighed the cost in another. The same framework might apply here. The genetic variants associated with same-sex attraction in men could be producing something else entirely in other individuals, something that increases fitness rather than reducing it. What exactly that something is, that's where the theories start to diverge. Some researchers point to patterns in how gay men's female relatives reproduce. Others look at social behavior, cooperation, the way certain traits might help a broader family group survive, even when one member doesn't reproduce directly. Neither of those explanations is fully worked out, and neither one alone accounts for everything the data shows. Several theories have been proposed to explain this, and none of them are completely satisfying on their own, which is probably because none of them are completely wrong either. One of the more compelling explanations is called kin selection, and the logic behind it is simpler than it sounds. The basic idea is this: evolution doesn't only care about whether you personally reproduce. It cares about whether your genes make it into the next generation, and your genes don't only live inside you. Your siblings carry roughly half of them. Your nieces and nephews carry about a quarter. So if you help those relatives survive and reproduce more successfully, you're still moving your genetic material forward, just through a different route. A gay uncle who puts serious time and energy into raising his brother's children is, in genetic terms, doing something that matters. The genes he carries don't have to pass through him directly to keep spreading. This is where a group in Samoa called the Fa'afafine become one of the most interesting data points in this entire field. Fa'afafine are men who identify as a third gender and are predominantly attracted to other men. They're a recognized and relatively well-studied part of Samoan culture, which makes them unusually useful for researchers trying to test this hypothesis in a real population. Psychologist Paul Vasey spent years conducting studies in Samoa, and what he found was striking. Fa'afafine showed significantly higher levels of investment in their nieces and nephews than either straight men or straight women did. More time, more resources, more direct care. And this wasn't explained by having more free time or fewer obligations. It appeared to be a genuine orientation toward kin investment. That's exactly what the kin selection hypothesis would predict. If the same genetic variants that contribute to same-sex attraction also produce traits like heightened social attunement, nurturing behavior, or stronger kin bonding, then those variants can still spread through the population even when the person carrying them isn't having children. The cost on one side gets offset by a benefit on the other. Now, it's worth being careful here, because correlation isn't confirmation. Finding that Fa'afafine invest heavily in relatives doesn't prove that's why the underlying genetics persists. It's consistent with the theory. It isn't proof. And replicating these findings in other populations has been harder, partly because no other group offers the same kind of culturally stable, socially integrated third gender category that allows for clean comparisons. But the core logic holds up. Evolution has more than one way to move genes through time, and direct reproduction is only the most obvious one. A trait that reduces individual fertility doesn't automatically get eliminated if it's doing something useful elsewhere in the family structure. The math can still work out. It's a clever solution to the paradox, but it probably isn't the only one. There's another piece of this that comes from studying not gay men themselves, but the women in their families. A team of researchers in Italy spent years tracing the family trees of gay men and comparing them against the families of straight men. What they found was striking. The maternal relatives of gay men, specifically their mothers, maternal aunts, and maternal grandmothers, had significantly more children on average than the equivalent relatives of straight men. Not a small difference. A measurable, consistent pattern that held up across multiple studies. The women on the maternal side of the family were, on average, more fertile. And that detail matters enormously because it points to something that the kin selection hypothesis alone doesn't fully explain. Here's what the researchers think is happening. The genetic variants linked to same-sex attraction in men may also increase attraction toward men in general. In a woman carrying those same variants, that means a stronger or more frequent attraction to male partners, which historically translated into more relationships, more pregnancies, and more children. The genes don't disappear from the population. They keep moving through the female line, generation after generation, occasionally producing gay men along the way. That's balancing selection working exactly as it's supposed to. A trait that reduces reproduction in one context is paying for itself in another, and the net result is that those variants stay in the gene pool. It's a cleaner explanation than it might sound at first. The genes aren't persisting despite the cost. They're persisting because the cost in one context is outweighed by a benefit somewhere else in the same family. Evolution doesn't evaluate individuals in isolation. It runs the math across the whole genetic ecosystem, and in this case, the math keeps coming out in favor of keeping those variants around. There's a separate line of evidence that adds another layer entirely. Research into fraternal birth order has shown that the more older biological brothers a man has, the more likely he is to be gay. Each additional older brother raises the odds by roughly 33%. This effect only shows up with biological brothers, not adopted ones, which tells you it's not about how you were raised. It's something physical happening during pregnancy. The leading explanation involves a protein called NLGN4Y, which is expressed on the Y chromosome. When a mother carries a male fetus, small amounts of this protein can enter her bloodstream. In some cases, her immune system builds a response to it. With each subsequent male pregnancy, that response gets stronger, and there's evidence it can affect how the fetal brain develops in ways that influence sexual orientation later in life. So you have two separate biological mechanisms, one genetic and one immunological, both producing the same outcome through completely different routes. That's not what you'd expect to see if this were a simple error or a one-time mutation. That's what you'd expect if multiple systems have been shaping this trait over a very long stretch of time. The same variants that occasionally produce gay men might be doing something useful enough on the other side of the equation that evolution keeps holding on to them. Genetics isn't the only biological mechanism on the table. There's another layer sitting underneath the DNA itself, and it's called epigenetics. Where genetics is about what your genes say, epigenetics is about whether those genes actually get turned on or off. The underlying sequence doesn't change. What changes is the expression. During fetal development, the brain is being shaped by hormones. Testosterone, estrogen, and other signaling molecules flood the womb at specific windows, and the timing matters enormously. Small shifts in hormone exposure during those windows can produce lasting differences in how the brain is wired. That's not controversial. What gets more complicated is the question of where those shifts come from. Some researchers have proposed that the mechanism involved is something called epimarks. These are molecular tags that sit on top of DNA and regulate how genes respond to hormonal signals. Normally, epimarks are erased between generations. Your body resets them so that each new child starts fresh. But sometimes, that erasure doesn't fully happen. A mark that was carried by a father gets passed down to a son. A mark that regulated hormone sensitivity in one body now operates in a completely different hormonal environment and produces a different outcome. A straight man could carry epimarks that were perfectly functional in his own development. But in a son, those same marks shift how the brain responds to testosterone during a critical window. The result isn't a mutation. The DNA hasn't changed at all. It's the same instructions being read differently. What makes this idea compelling is that it doesn't require same-sex attraction to be directly selected for. The epimarks weren't coded to produce any particular outcome. They were adaptive in one context and carry over into another, where they do something different. That's a much easier thing for evolution to leave in place, because it doesn't look like a cost until it occasionally surfaces in a specific developmental environment. The research here is still early. The original paper proposing this model came from William Rice and colleagues in 2012, and the hypothesis hasn't been fully confirmed by direct evidence yet. Testing epigenetic transmission across generations is technically difficult, and the picture is still being filled in. It's still contested, but it adds another layer to what is clearly a much more complicated picture than a single gene switching on or off. So when did this actually start? The genetic variants linked to sexual orientation aren't new. They're not clustered in one region of the genome the way a recent mutation tends to be. They're spread across hundreds of locations on multiple chromosomes, distributed across every human population that's ever been studied. That kind of pattern doesn't happen fast. It builds over enormous stretches of time, which means researchers aren't talking about thousands of years. They're talking about hundreds of thousands, at minimum. But even that number might be conservative, because when you look beyond humans, the picture gets older. Same-sex behavior shows up in bonobos, our closest living relatives alongside chimpanzees. It shows up in gorillas and other great apes. These aren't animals that learned anything from human culture. They're species that share a common ancestor with us, and that ancestor lived roughly 6 million years ago, which means whatever biological wiring is producing this behavior was already present before the human lineage split off and became its own thing. This predates Homo sapiens entirely. It predates Homo erectus. It was there before the genus Homo even existed. That's not a small claim. It means we're not looking at a trait that emerged somewhere in human history and spread. We're looking at something that was already baked into the biology of our ancestors before our ancestors were ancestors. The 2019 genome-wide study found those variants in people from Europe, North America, and East Asia, populations that have been genetically separated for tens of thousands of years. And the signal was consistent across all of them. That consistency doesn't happen unless the trait is genuinely ancient and genuinely stable. So the question people tend to ask, which is why do humans become gay, turns out to be slightly the wrong question. The more interesting question is why anyone assumed this needed a modern explanation in the first place. It's not a recent development. It's not a product of any particular civilization or era. It's not something that needs to be traced back to a specific moment in history, because that moment is somewhere in the deep past, before recorded language, before our species had its current form, before we were recognizably human at all. It didn't appear in ancient Greece, it wasn't invented by modern culture, and it wasn't a mutation that slipped through the cracks. It's been part of what humans are for longer than humans have existed. The picture that emerges from all of this isn't a single clean answer, but it is a coherent one. Same-sex attraction isn't a malfunction that evolution forgot to fix. It's ancient, it's stable, and it shows up in every human population that has ever been studied. That's not what a mistake looks like. That's what a feature looks like. The genetic variants linked to it are spread across dozens of chromosomes. They're found in people on every continent. They've been part of our biology for longer than our species has had a name. Evolution had millions of years to eliminate this. It didn't. That tells you something. What the research keeps pointing toward is that this trait persists through multiple overlapping mechanisms at once: kin selection, female fertility effects, epigenetic inheritance. None of those explanations is complete on its own, but they don't need to be. They work together. The same variants that occasionally produce gay men may be increasing the reproductive success of female relatives, strengthening social bonds within families, passing through generations in ways that the standard reproduction-only model of fitness completely misses. Evolution doesn't optimize individuals in isolation. It works across whole family networks, across populations, across deep time. And a trait that keeps showing up across millions of years and hundreds of species was never being selected against in any meaningful way. It was being maintained. The question was never really why some people are gay. The more interesting question is why we spent so long treating it as a problem that needed explaining, rather than a pattern that needed understanding. It was never a glitch in the system. It was part of the system the whole time.